Hello and welcome to the Firelink Conspiracy. My aim with this series is to uncover every secret and take note of every detail present in the Dark Souls series of games. Expect spoilers for the entire Dark Souls trilogy. This episode will be covering the opening cinematic. The opening cinematic starts by telling us of the formation of the world.
The world was unformed, shrouded by fog.
When the world was unformed, there was no fire, and therefore no duality. We can see many stationary dragon statues and arch trees. One thing to note is that there is no sea. There doesn't seem to be water anywhere, although the image has a very picturesque blue hue to it. Another observation is that the dragon statues seem to not possess any life at this point. I believe that state of being is what is considered everlasting. The dragons were everlasting because they weren't alive yet. But then there was fire, and with fire came disparity. We get a brief description of some of the disparities. Another thing I want to point out is that, according to the way it's phrased, the narrator doesn't imply that life and death, heat and cold, and light and dark were all necessarily born from the flame. It more so means that the disparity between those elements was created. About the fire, we can see it was born in what could be considered the abyss of the world at that point in time. Below the surface, below an arch tree. We can see that sparks of the fire are leaving the arch tree and penetrating the surface, effectively rising up from that underground. It's worth mentioning now that, in my understanding, the sparks that rose up were what gave life to the everlasting dragons. The sparks are, in essence, very small amounts of soul. Moving on, we get a view of the life forms born inside that abyss. From the dark they came indeed.
And found the souls of lords within the flame.
We get a brief description of the beings that found the Lord's souls, and right after that, we skip to the war against the dragons. I have a lot to say about this segment of the cinematic, as I believe it to be a very reductionistic view of that period of history. I view it more as a tale being recited by the narrator than an accurate, synchronous description of historical events. The beings that came from the dark didn't simply get the Lord's souls and immediately after that challenge the dragons for no reason. I believe that between the introduction of the first humans and the war of the dragons, there is an entire era of history that spans many centuries at the very least and should not be overlooked.
With the strength of lords, they challenged the dragons.
Let's examine this one fact. All beings born of the dark look to be hollows, and there is no specific god among them. At some point, they are all what we call hollow. They weren't born inherently as gods or humans. All souls come from the fire. Every single living creature you kill drops the souls. Even Nito, even the descendants of the Archdragons throughout the games, even the personification of the Dark Abyss himself. Humanities as we know them also contain very small amounts of fire, even though it's mostly consumed by darkness, and what we can see of it has gone colorless. The humanities prize you find in the dark chasm of the abyss drop us very small amounts of souls, along with humanity. So it seems that everything that has a soul is alive in some way. What I'll follow this with is more so speculation, however, I do wish to delve even deeper. What was the humans' situation before the War of the Dragons? And why did the war happen? How did the gods come into existence? Let's start from the beginning. I personally believe that the pygmy was the first one to explore the flame surroundings, and also the first to harvest a large soul from it. And from that point, he distributed it in small quantities, creating the humans, who then went about gathering Lord souls for themselves. Let me elaborate on this. Nito is shown harvesting a soul, but it's unsure if it is from the first flame. He's potentially administering the death of another being, like is described on his Lord soul. At that point, he seems to already be the powerful being we see fight in the war and in game. The Witch of Izalith is shown already wearing her witch attire, interacting with her daughters, and all of them look to be in human form. It's also not easy to say if they are harvesting a Lord Soul, but even if they are, they seem to already be part of a cultural group. The witch could be distributing the Lord Soul to her daughters in preparation for the war, or this could be the ritual of the creation of the Chaos Flame. But I think the latter option isn't as substantiated, given that we know the birth of the Chaos Flame wasn't until after the Dragon War. Gwyn is shown with his army of knights in his great lord robe and looks to be very old, so it's hard to justify the scene happening before his gathering of power. He could be administering a piece of his Lord Soul, preparing his army for battle against the dragons. Another possibility is that this is a depiction of the linking of the flame, but I don't think that's very likely given that the Age of Fire wasn't even introduced yet. Meanwhile, the pygmy is the only one of those beings who still looks like the day that came from the dark. He's naked, frail, and appears to be at the same place we see them emerging from. Even though he seems to be in human form, he doesn't seem to be a member of any group or culture. He's shown very clearly harvesting a Lord Soul from the ground, unlike the others. The narrator also notes that he's so easily forgotten, and that's something I can think of many reasons for, one of them being that he didn't use his Lord Soul in order to make an empire for himself or to become a powerful entity like the others did, and thus was less known. But another reason that doesn't contradict this last one is that he may now be easily forgotten due to the passing of time. I not only think he was the first to collect a Lord Soul, but also that the gap between that event and the other Lords obtaining theirs may be of many generations. Miyazaki confirmed that he is humanity's ancestor, as stated on an interview. It isn't written anywhere, but the image is something like humanity's ancestor. He found the Lord Soul, fragmented it, and humanity are like the fragments of it, kinda like an ancestor. So the descendants, the humans, have a part of that Lord Soul. I believe the difference between the ordinary humans and the supposed deities is only the amount of Lord Soul they have within them. They all came from the dark, and they all used to share the same form. However, the humanity sprites are somewhat unlike the Lord Souls, given that they have a dark interior. I think that, since they are dark by nature, the small fragments of fire they imbue themselves with got consumed by their inner dark. So the pygmy found his Lord Soul and distributed it to the other hollows, and that was when humanity was born. And I think that it was during this time that the first humans started to develop societies and different factions, and, eventually, other groups of humans found Lord Souls and went about creating their own powerful empires with their newfound power. These newborn lords, which were previously human, fabricated their godhood status. They weren't inherently powerful. Their power was acquired in the same fashion as the furtive pygmies, although, instead of sharing it to the extent of their ancestor, they kept the majority of that Lord Soul for themselves and their relatives and their most trusted subordinates. So, the humans have established societal structures, families are a thing, religion is most likely present, and there's even organized armies and different factions. They weren't the same weak hollows of yore.
With the strength of lords.
So, with the strength of lords, they challenged the dragons. But why did they challenge the dragons? The answer may be quite simple. They wanted to exit the abyssal underground and conquer the surface of the world. Yes, I believe humans lived for centuries below the ground, unable to rise up to the surface since that was the domain of the mighty dragons. That was the motivation for all of humanity to call for unity against the common enemy. Until the latter half of the cinematic, we don't see a single shot of the outside world where there are humanoids. The surface seems to be entirely devoid of civilization, and features only the powerful dragons and their nests. And I don't entirely disagree that very small communities of humans could have possibly existed on the surface before the war started. But I believe there's a good reason for the call for mass extermination of the dragonoids. They were the apex species of the surface. Humans couldn't live outside of their confinements and were threatened by the presence of such powerful creatures. The war was not a simple process. It was in fact a very complex period of history that most likely spanned centuries. We also get signs of rebellion coming from both sides. I will now be analyzing the war segment of the cinematic and the evidence it provides to support this thesis. After that, I will be furthering my point by highlighting some in-game references. The cinematic shows us some of the events that took place during the war. Gwyn's army tearing the stone scales of the dragons, the witches summoning a great firestorm, and Nito's miasma of death and disease. Much like the previous segment of the cinematic, I think the scenes are presented to us out of order. Pay attention to the atmosphere. When the world was unformed, there was a very strong blue hue, and the sky was fairly dark as well. However, when we get to see Gwyn's attack, the sky lost its blue color and now displays a very weak green. Right after, we get a very strong purple, and then right after that it's blue again, etc. That's specifically weird since we know day and night don't work the same way in Dark Souls as they do in real life. I believe it makes more sense if the order went like this. Nito, unleashing his miasma, dried out the trees so that the fire could spread more easily. Look at the sky, it's blue just like it was when he saw it at the start of the cinematic. Then, the witches grave the firestorms, damaging the dragons and their environment. Now, the sky gets a purple hue, which is indicative of the red of the hellfire clashing with the strong blue. And lastly, after the fire went out, Gwyn and his army of knights went to the surface to finish the surviving ash dragons. We can see that the sky is mostly colorless, and only its light green din is visible. Another very interesting detail I want to point out is that during the Gwyn scene, we can even see a couple of what I think are dragon bones on the background. The same piles of organic material can be seen during Sif's beat, I think, but there the material isn't decomposed enough to match visually. This could be further indication that we are seeing history out of chronological order. I will now reference in-game hints that can help enlighten our view of this period. As I've said, I think the war may have lasted for many centuries, and thus, even after the humans had gotten access to the surface world and had begun to establish new societal structures and kingdoms there, the dragons were still not entirely eradicated. And so, the war may have turned from an epic conflict into less expansive but still massive in scope hunting campaigns over time. The humanoids were trying to make the dragons face total extinction. By this time, the original species of archdragons were already largely extinct, as evident by their lack of presence within the various kingdoms and places we visit throughout the series. Even Archdragon Peak and Lothric, which are environments not hostile to dragons. But their descendants, like wyverns and drakes, were still somewhat prevalent. I want to start out by pointing at a small bit of information. The spear used by the Nameless King states that it is the earliest form of the cross spear, implying that there was even an evolutionary line to the weaponry utilized by the Dragon Slayers. If we compare this to our real-life history, we can get the implication that the change of weaponry wasn't something that happened within a short period of time for no reason. By comparing the sword spear to its later iteration, we get the impression that the dragons were also changing in shape over time. The dragon heads we find in Anor Londo, as well as those wielded as shields by the Ringed Knights, can give us a better picture of what that might have looked like. I believe it was at the start of this dragon hunting era that the biggest internal conflicts began to arise within the humanoids. possibly right after the capital of the gods was built, since there are still ominous remnants of the war deity's presence, featured in a couple of different places throughout Lordran, like the broken statue found on the Sunlight Altar, and possibly even in the cathedral itself. So at this point, the Nameless King, probably along with some of his most faithful knights, tactical allies and devoted followers, sided with the dragons and defiled his godhood. The Ringed Knights were commanded by the gods and partook in the dragon's laying. We don't exactly know how important they were, but given that the shields feature heads that most closely resemble wyverns, which are merely descendants of the original archdragons, their participation may have been after the initial conflict with the primal species. Their contributions were also never properly addressed and apparently got eradicated by the annals of history. Now for a very important topic. Titanite, as we know it, and all of its variations, may have been the result of dragon corpses mixing with destroyed ash tree remains and other elements during the war. I speculate that most of the creatures we encounter are born of those different Titanite and similar materials that have been brought to life by a spark of soul. This is easily observable if we take a look at the absurd number of creatures that drops us minerals. It appears that depending on the species and the circumstances of its environment, we get a corresponding Titanite. Where the Titanite comes from? Probably the creature itself. In fact, I could go even further with this argument and ask, why do we get Titanite out of humans that don't even wield weapons or... Well, I won't delve too deep for now. Moving on. Miyazaki strongly suggested that the original dragons were part mineral. As Miyazaki said, I'm also a huge fan of the Gaping Dragon. It's a little different from the other dragons in the world. It was part of an ancient race of mineral-based life forms existing long before the emergence of mankind. The Stone Dragon is not alive. The ancient dragons are half living, half element, so there's no pain for them. As I've said before, I believe the everlasting dragons were everlasting because they weren't alive, since the fire didn't exist yet. At that point, they might have been purely mineral, like statues. The arch trees were also made of stone. The Caduceus round shield from the first game reads, "The giant trees in Lordran are distant offspring of the great stone arch trees. This shield inherits their properties, and the wood greatly reduces magic damage." Their shifting from stone to wood may have been because of interactions with different elements as time went by, like fire, and elements that possibly appeared eons after the initial formation, or water that also wasn't visible during the Age of Ancients, so it's unsure if it existed or not. The ancient dragon from Dark Souls 2, for example, appears to have shifted in the same way. We can see his stone body in a memory of the past, and when we encounter it in-game, he appears more wood-like, with vines growing on his now brown skin. The old stone dragon from the first game also looks more like a wood dragon by the time we see it. It seems like a slow, gradual process, and different subjects may experience it in varying degrees. Now for a clear example of a creature that most likely emerged during the war from remains of dragons and arch trees like I just described, let's go with the giants. Every single giant mob from Lordran and from Lothric drop large Titanite or chunks of Titanite. In the third game, the giant slaves look like very mossy and damaged chunks of stone, and you can even see on their injuries that their bodies are still somewhat reminiscent of their older counterparts. The Dark Souls 2 style giants appear to have a similar composition to their form. They seem very stone-like as well. However, after death, they literally become wooden trees. That may be the clearest example of what the Caduceus round shield described we actually see in game. The differences between them and the other giants may be due to the fact that they are an isolated group of giants, since they established their own kingdom to the north, while the other giants seem to have lived as slaves in Lordaeron and Lothric. Now, I want to clarify something quickly. I think giants and bigger humans, like the Witch of Islith, for example, are not the same thing. Giants appear to have a completely different body, and they either don't have a face, as is the case with the giants we see in Drang Lake, or their face is hidden by a mask or helmet, in the case of the slave giants. So you shouldn't assume they look like regular humans. The vast majority of Dragonoid enemies throughout the series, like other creatures, also drop reinforcing materials akin to Titanite, depending on the species. Some species are even referred to as incomplete or imperfect dragons, like the serpents for example. And of course, there's even an enemy in the second game who's literally called the Imperfect, and they drop various Titanite. In conclusion, most, if not all creatures seem to be at least partially made of one or more of the various types of Titanite. And all of the different Titanite have possibly originated from the dragons, which were half living, half element mineral based life forms, and archeries. And this is the end of the first chapter of the Firelink Conspiracy. Thank you for watching. I'd very much appreciate if you liked this video and subscribe to this channel if you look forward to more. So, hopefully, I'll see you later.